If the US invades Iran by land, here's the likely endgame. If the US launched a ground invasion of Iran, the most likely outcome would be a long, costly war. The core question is not whether the United States could break into Iran militarily. It could. The harder question is whether it could seize, pacify, and hold a country of more than 91.5 million people, spanning about 1.745 million square kilometers. While Iran still retains meaningful missile capacity and the Strait of Hormuz remains a global economic pressure point, the model's answer is blunt. A US invasion would more likely produce a strong opening blow than a clean victory. The highest probability path is not rapid stabilization. It is a messy sequence: initial battlefield gains, partial regime fracture, hardening local resistance, regional retaliation, shipping disruption, rising oil prices, and then a grinding political decision in Washington over whether the objective is conquest, punishment, regime change, or managed exit. The overlooked hinge is scale. Iran is neither Iraq in 2003 nor Afghanistan in 2001. It is larger, more populous, more mountainous, and more integrated into a web of regional coercive tools built precisely to raise the cost of direct attack. The story turns on whether the United States is trying to defeat Iran's army or govern Iran afterward. Key points. The model gives the US a better-than-even chance of early military gains, but not a favorable chance of durable control. Initial battlefield success is modeled at 59%, while stable occupation by 18 months is only 9%. A quick collapse of the Iranian state is possible, but not the central case. Regime collapse within 6 months comes out at 30%, meaning the more likely outcome is either partial survival of the regime or fragmented authority. The most probable strategic trap is insurgency. The model puts the odds of a prolonged insurgency over 2 years at 72%, which is why the long-run outlook is worse than the opening phase. Regional escalation is not a side issue. It is built into the architecture of the conflict. The model gives a 60% chance of wider war expansion and a 72% chance of extended Hormuz disruption. Economic fallout would hit fast. With roughly 20 million barrels per day of oil and oil products moving through Hormuz in 2025, even short disruption would carry global consequences. The most reliable indicator of potential conflict is the sufficiency of force. A historic RAND stabilization benchmark implies roughly 1.83 million security personnel would be needed to stabilize a post-conflict Iran-sized society, far beyond any plausible US invasion force. Why the opening phase could look deceptively successful. On the narrow military question, the United States would enter with overwhelming air power, strike depth, surveillance, logistics, and naval reach. Iran's conventional forces are large on paper, with roughly 610,000 active duty personnel and about 350,000 reservists, but they are not built to win a symmetric, open battle against the US military. That is why the model still gives Washington a 59% chance of substantial battlefield success in the first 90 days. We could hit, isolate, or seize ports, coastal nodes, selected bases, and some transport corridors. In a purely tactical sense, American forces could likely impose severe damage on fixed formations and critical infrastructure early. But battlefield penetration is not political control. The invasion force needed to enter Iran is much smaller than the force needed to dominate its urban belts, road networks, mountain corridors, energy infrastructure, and internal security environment at the same time. Where the real war would begin, Iran's geography is a defender's gift. Mountain systems, basin structure, choke points, and long internal lines make it difficult to translate an entry operation into stable national control. Much of the country sits inside a ring of heavily eroded mountain ranges, and that matters because invasion is not only about marching in, it is about resupply, exposure, ambush risk, and the sheer difficulty of turning firepower into lasting authority. Population scale compounds the problem. Iran's 2024 population stood at 91,567,738. An Iran-wide occupation would require approximately 1.83 million personnel, based on RAND's historic rule of thumb of about 20 security personnel for every 1,000 inhabitants needed for post-conflict stabilization. The US military had about 1.33 million active duty troops worldwide in 2025, and not all are available, deployable, or suitable for long-term occupation duty. That mismatch is the heart of the forecast. The model does not assume that the United States would attempt to occupy every part of Iran. It assumes that any serious attempt to impose political control over the country would run straight into a manpower ceiling. That is the statistical reason the occupation success number collapses to 9%. What most coverage misses? Most coverage fixates on the invasion phase, landings, marines, special operations raids, armored thrusts, and whether Iran's conventional order of battle would crumble. That matters, but it is not the main strategic question. The main strategic question is what happens after the first dramatic maps are drawn. The model is shaped less by can the US break Iran's front line than by can the US govern the space it opens. Once that becomes the central problem, the probabilities flip sharply against a clean outcome. That is why the model can give the US there is a decent chance of early battlefield success, but there is still a 75% chance of withdrawal within 3 years without a decisive settlement. The opening fight and the political end state are not the same war. Missiles, proxies, and the cost of trying to hold the ground. Even now, after weeks of strikes, US intelligence can confirm only about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal destroyed with certainty, while another third may be damaged, buried, or inaccessible rather than conclusively eliminated. Iran has continued firing at neighbors, and officials have described underground facilities and tunneling as a major challenge. That matters because a ground invasion would not happen in a missile-free environment. It would happen under continuing risk to ports, ships, bases, airfields, and regional infrastructure. The model therefore treats regional escalation and maritime disruption as structurally linked to any land campaign rather than optional side branches. Hormuz is the economic multiplier. The strait carried nearly 20 million barrels per day of oil in 2025, with limited alternative route capacity of roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. If invasion pushed Iran toward a maximum cost strategy at sea, the shock would travel beyond the battlefield almost immediately. The human and political burden. The article is about likelihood, not moralizing, but history matters. Brown's Costs of War project estimates that direct war violence across major post-9/11 theaters killed more than 940,000 people, with civilians making up more than 432,000 of them, and far larger indirect death tolls beyond that. That does not mean Iran would replicate those wars exactly. The burden of "we can invade" is historically different from "we can end this well." The current war also underlines the expense curve. CSIs wrote that the first 6 days of the present campaign cost about $11.3 billion, rising to an estimated $16.5 billion by day 12. A true ground invasion would sit on top of costs like that, not replace them. The fork in the road now. The most likely result of a US ground invasion of Iran is not a neat replay of shock and awe mythology. It is a two-stage trap. Tactical dominance first, strategic exhaustion later. That is why the model's center of gravity is so lopsided. 59% for early battlefield success sounds manageable. 72% for prolonged insurgency, 72% for extended Hormuz disruption, and 75% for withdrawal without decisive settlement sound like the real balance sheet. The signposts to watch are simple: whether Washington frames the mission as raids or occupation, whether Iran preserves missile salvos and proxy attacks despite air pressure, whether Hormuz disruption deepens, and whether US troop numbers begin moving from operational entry levels toward politically unsustainable occupation levels. If those signals intensify together, the invasion story stops being about invasion and starts being about entrapment.